Hey, hello, August has come and gone, which means it is time to attempt to briefly wrap up August reading, and so let's jump right into it. I started the month with Radiant Sin by Katee which is the next in her Dark Olympus series. This is the Apollo and Cassandra book, and so I was very interested in how this was going to be approached based on, the actual mythology of Apollo and Cassandra, especially because, spoiler alert, this has a happily ever after for Apollo and Cassandra. And so this takes a work romance of sorts approach. We have Cassandra, who is the assistant for Apollo. Apollo is a lot of the information of the city. Cassandra is trying to get out of the city. She is also able to see things about the city that others can't, which is the kind of draw on her prophecies that are not believed. And then this moves into a house party book in that they are going and pretending to be in a relationship in order to gather information at this house party. We're building directly off of things that came out of Helen's book here. And I was really excited about that because I do love a good house party, though this, of course, takes the house party and the house party games to even steamier heights. Here, again, we have a plus-size heroine, which I absolutely love. We also have a bisexual heroine, and we have some drawing rooms after hours fully utilized. So this absolutely really was still rooted in this world that we've been building out over the course of this series, and this is actually expanding the plotting of the world quite a lot because we have these outsiders coming in. We have the sense that the power dynamic of the 13 may be in danger here. And so here we're getting a little bit more information about what is going on. And I will be very, very interested to see how this is continued to build out through the rest of the series and how this world continues to expand, because I think that it is taking some really interesting twists and it's helping build out the through line arc of the series more. So of course, Apollo and Cassandra are at the height here. The sexual tension was great, the sense that these two have been attracted to each other for quite a long time, but Apollo wasn't going to make a move because Cassandra was his employee and he was more interested in offering her protection after the scandal related to her family. And this sense that this job that they are going on is giving Cassandra a way out of the city then puts this kind of time constraint on this attraction and this idea that maybe they can act on it because soon Cassandra's gonna leave. Also, if you are a fan of the only one bed trope like my friend Emily, we've got you covered here. And then I read The Foxglove King by Hannah Witten. We have talked about this more in depth in a Feature Friday. I did enjoy this, and at the same time, I definitely think it could have been edited down. One of the things that I was most drawn to in this book was the sexual tension between all of our kind of leads that establish themselves in this book, and that tension could be conceivably resolved in a myriad of ways, though admittedly, we do not get that resolution in this book because we're setting up a series. And that is part, I think, of where I felt like things could have been tightened and edited down. I understand that we are establishing a longer arc here. There was a really delicious twist at the end of this that it really felt like we needed to build to in a way for that to pay off in the right way. And then that is establishing a lot to come. But some of the dawdling in the narrative made it so we lost some of those personal stakes. And it also didn't feel like all of our characters were drawn out as fully as they could have been, considering the time we were spending with them. But ultimately, we have Lore, who has this kind of magical power to raise the dead, and it's very much zombie-esque rather than like actual powers over life and death. Though I will be very interested to see if these powers kind of progress over the course of the series, if they change, if they morph, because the powers and the magic of the world were a little underdeveloped for me as a reader. Sometimes I didn't fully understand what was going on with them, but I think as a reader, I wasn't necessarily meant to. Part of that reveal was the point. Now, some of the reveals that we were dangling felt a little forced and that they were drawn out past what felt natural for the sake of that reveal, but I do understand the instinct. So here we have Lore, who is being sent to the palace by the king after being captured because she works with basically some drug smugglers of this world, and she's sent to spy on the prince, who the king believes is colluding with the enemy. The book also wants us to believe at the beginning of this, or at least Lore wants to believe, that she is a good spy. They're at least telling her she's a good spy. My belief in that she is a good spy is somewhat shaken over the course of the book, and I don't know if we as readers are really supposed to buy into that, because she really is kind of discombobulated for a lot of this. We have a prince who always seems to be one step ahead of her. He is very much that kind of rakish, roguish prince with secrets, and this idea that he may know more about the power dynamics and have more going on than his just party boy exterior. And then amidst all of this, she is also partnered with one of basically the monks of this religious world, and he is kind of set as her keeper in some ways, but he is also the way that she is going to be believable entering this world, because he has a title that he has kind of not fully renounced. The world has kind of renounced for him. His father was a traitor. The sins of the father follow the son in this world. And so he has joined this church to basically repent in whatever way he believes is necessary, but he also has a past with the prince. And so there we've got our triangle that I have hopes may be resolved in a different way than we have conventionally seen such triangles resolved. However, again, we've seen no resolution here. So like I said, I really do like the tension that is built. However, I think some of that editing down would have helped further these characters and their development, because right now they feel a little bit like they're playing into archetypes, and I love the archetypes, don't get me wrong, but I also want to believe them as full people and characters and understand those motivations outside of what those archetypes would conventionally do, if that makes sense. So I think there's a lot of potential here. I still really enjoyed myself. I will be interested to see what the second book brings us, but at the same time, I was expecting it to really push that extra little bit further to really fully envelop me in the world, and I will be interested to see if I feel like I am more fully enveloped in the world in the second book, where we've had some of these reveals, and so it won't feel like we're playing some of our cards just really close to our chest in terms of the world building. However, at the same time, I don't know if all of those cards really needed to be played so close to the chest, because some of the revelations, some of the twists and turns were not particularly shocking. That doesn't mean they weren't satisfying, but we could have allowed ourselves a little bit more development that we lost when we were trying to talk around the thing that I don't know we always necessarily needed to be talking around. And then I read Chlorine by Jade Song, which we also talked about more in depth for a Feature Friday. This is about a young swimmer who becomes a mermaid amidst the horrors and challenges of adolescence, and it really does delve in to the horror of growing into your body, whatever that may mean, and the ways that our bodies kind of betray us in that time, as well as looking at the real pressures of being a serious athlete, especially at this age, as well as how that impacts a variety of relationships and some of the inappropriate relationships that are unfortunately all too common in these arenas. And there is this sense, as I talked about in the Feature Friday, of this kind of dissonance and distance within the narrative itself. Our protagonist is really trying to distance herself in some ways from this action. And there is also a lot of mental health exploration that very intentionally keeps the narrative somewhat at arm's length, and it really is structured very specifically around our protagonist's journey as a professional athlete, as a professional swimmer. And so there really is that focus on this being her entire world. And so then when we are talking about the mermaid side of things, because there is this question throughout as our protagonist is talking about herself as a mermaid, and she's talking about humans and humans' emotions from a remove. And so there is this sense of, what does this idea of being a mermaid in this book mean? And is our character a mermaid in a sense of she has actually become a mermaid? How odd are we exploring this world in this narrative? Is it the truth? Is there this element of magical realism, of transformation? Is it all in her mind in some way? Is it the more kind of complicated and accurate amalgamation of the two? And there is, as I said, a lot of body horror in this novel. There is a lot of violence around the way we talk about bodies, because the idea of bodies, and especially bodies going through puberty in the way that they are explored in this book, feel especially violent. And so, not to spoil too much, but some of the violence is incredibly intentional as a way to reclaim power. And there is a sense of the exploration of mermaids as a reclaiming of power, because we are looking at the darker reality and vision of a mermaid here. And so this book was incredibly layered and complicated, and there was a lot that was really being explored. There was a lot to dig your teeth into. Again, I bought basically a whole reading journal just to try and parse through some of my thoughts, which I articulate much better in the Feature Friday if you're interested and have not watched. rushed. However, at times, the narrative is incredibly slow, especially because our protagonist is going through a lot of mental health struggles. And so, like I said, that keeps us as readers sometimes a little bit at a remove. And so there are times that we're kind of waiting, very unsure through this narrative, or at least sometimes I was. Additionally, there is a lot of shocking content in some ways. And I know I talk a lot about this idea of shock value just for the sake of shock value in novels. Here, I do not think that was the case. There were admittedly points that did kind of like shock me out of the moment that I did have to kind of sit with and register my even disgust at some points at the way that body and body functions were being explored, but also the reality of that and how grounded that felt in some ways as well. And just the way we talk about our bodies, especially at this time, the kind of flowery euphemisms we often fall into, but the reality of that and having to think back to the reality of that and what that felt like. And that was a long time ago for me, admittedly. But also that's just a real and particular moment that we often don't articulate in such ways that I think we're really illuminating. And being able to look at that and the way our bodies morph and change. So we're also looking at this kind of morphing and changing on two levels, right? But in thinking of the athletic side of it, you have these changes that you can't control that can ultimately impact your performance as an athlete without you being able to really control that aspect. I know I said control twice. It is what it is. You can't control it. So I don't know. There's a lot to dig into here, like I said, but the narrative is a little bit denser in some ways. It's a very short book, but you're gonna have to, or at least I had to sit with it a little bit longer than I anticipated. And then to completely shift, because moving out of this book, I needed something a little lighter, and I decided to go back to my bread and butter with a historical romance, and I read How the Wallflower Was Won by Eva Lee. This is the sequel to The Good Girl's Guide to Rakes, which we read many moons ago and talked about in my Rake Off video. And so this is following Finn, who is the brother from the first book, and he was also established in the first book as a gambler. He was very aloof. He was kind of moving in and out of the world, kind of going to his clubs and whatnot. But if you remember the setup from the first book, the whole gist of it is that these two brothers helped break their sister's wedding with their best friend because their best friend essentially got cold feet. So by romance rules, we know Dominic, the friend, will ultimately end back up with Willa, their sister. They just have to earn it. But in the meantime, these parents, because the parents are friends, have set up this ultimatum that all three of these gentlemen have to get married within, I believe it was a year. There's a time constraint there in order to still have their inheritance. And Finn does not want to get married. He understands that he will have to in order to protect his brother and his friend, but he doesn't want to. He, however, meets Tabitha in the library at a party, and Tabitha is a kind of bookish wallflower type, very smart, and she is aiming for entry into this scholarly society that has been limited to men. However, they have told her, well, if you get married, we would consider letting you in. And so she has really grasped onto this because there's some upcoming legislation that she really wants to help have a voice in. And so Finn thinks, great, I will pair her up with Dominic and things will be sunshine and roses. I'm sorry, the cicadas are screaming again. It's the middle of the day. I hate them. Anyway, so you might be like, Melody, why doesn't Finn just marry her himself? It seems like it would be a convenience, a marriage of convenience, if you will, for both of them. They eventually get there, but the reason that Finn is ultimately so aloof is that he has this secret that he has been carrying, that he is not a great reader. He is basically illiterate, and he carries a lot of shame around this. And Tabitha is this blue stocking, this intellectual, and he ultimately doesn't think that he would be able to offer her the future she ultimately desires. However, Dominic is eventually like, hey, it's not gonna happen, and Finn and Tabitha eventually enter in a marriage of convenience. They get close, the attraction is already there, and of course, because Tabitha is Tabitha, she eventually figures out this secret. And so then it's about them navigating this marriage, navigating how they see themselves in the world, because you have two protagonists that have been kind of outcasts in some ways within society at large. And so then they are finding this home and this appreciation with each other. We have these beautiful scenes of them reading together, Tabitha reading to Finn. It's a lot of fun. I will say some of the secrets that were kind of drawn out, specifically in Finn's reveal, I don't know if the pacing always worked for me because I really did enjoy how that was done and handled. I think that was great. I loved seeing that vulnerability from our hero and how that played out, absolutely. But then some of the plotting itself and what kind of led to that third act climax and tension, I didn't always buy. However, that kind of pressure moment really was related to this idea that these two characters are able to see each other in a way that the rest of society can't, like I said. And so there is a lot of vulnerability there for the both of them, and looking at how they expect to navigate this relationship and how the other sees them. And so yeah, there's definitely a lot to love there. And I think there was a lot of potential. There was seeding of that third act kind of blow up, but I think if it had been built up a little bit differently, it would have landed just a little stronger for me, because it was such a large reaction to something that in the moment didn't feel as large to me, just because it hadn't been made to feel as large for me, if that makes sense. But still really loved this one. And then I listened to Saving Time by Jenny Odell. This is the author of How to Do Nothing. I did this on audio. I did How to Do Nothing in print. I do think that Saving Time was more approachable than How to Do Nothing. Again, that first kind of introduction to How to Do Nothing, I do think was the densest. I didn't have any internal tangents about performance art ethics in Saving Time, so that was definitely a plus. It felt like it was a little bit more focused in some ways. At the same time, we were really breaking up the conception of time in different chapters and portions. The portion that sticks with me the most is the idea of thinking about time as a capitalist kind of construct in some ways, but I think it really is an interesting exploration. You know, we can throw out the phrase time is a construct as much as we want, kind of facetiously, but really looking at the idea that time is a construct, the history of how we kind of got to time as we think of it in the modern age, the history of the railroads and how that made the standardization of time more important. All of these things really was interesting, because it's really kind of clarifying that how we think about time today isn't how we've always historically thought about time. And I definitely understand the interests here after the explorations in How to Do Nothing. So this, I definitely think I responded to better. I think I gleaned more from it, though I do think I would need to go back and revisit to fully appreciate. I don't remember a kind of overarching takeaway or kind of hypothesis that we were really kind of attacking this material with, but that could just be my faulty memory. Okay, and then we've got The Duchess Effect by Tracy Livesay. I was both excited and reserved about this one, because this is a sequel to a romance novel. We had a happily ever after, or a happily for now, in American royalty, and so I wasn't sure why we were revisiting this. However, I do take some of that back, in that after diving in, I definitely understand that there is more story to tell here. However, this book is really kind of structured around this idea of navigating their relationship post, you know, being made public, and this idea of trying to separate Duchess's career from the royal family and all of these things and the tensions there, and it didn't really land for me. There was this kind of secret at the heart of this book, not the secret that I thought it might be. Thank goodness, obviously, but Duchess and Jameson had kind of entered this agreement that they were going to kind of keep their professional lives separate from their relationship. And yet when Duchess went to a meeting with those looking to buy her skincare company, they were really interested in pushing the optics of this relationship as PR, as a way to garner interest in the brand. And Duchess had to basically make a decision, but she doesn't talk it out with Jameson. So that was really frustrating, because I didn't understand why that conversation wasn't had. I understand that you had just entered this agreement that you were going to keep these things separate, but you could just talk about how the meeting went, especially if you're looking to enter this long-standing relationship. And at the beginning of the book, they haven't really been together that long. So there is that sense that they are navigating this newness, but they are talking in a very forever kind of way, especially because the stakes are so high and they made such a kind of bang at the end of American royalty that they do kind of have to be thinking that way in some ways. And so I just didn't understand why we couldn't get over that communication hurdle. And I understand that there are hurdles in communication, that is natural in many ways. I've really had to kind of check myself on being so frustrated by miscommunication because I recognize that I also don't like conflict. However, here, it just was especially frustrating. And then because of that, the intimate scenes just didn't read for me and also felt kind of forced. And I didn't enjoy it. It didn't feel like it really had an overarching structure. Everything revolved around this secret. And I think that there were ways to play out the continuation of this relationship to illustrate the stakes of their lives and how their personal and professional were kind of melding and crossing in ways that they didn't always want them to, but I don't think that this was the way to do it, unfortunately. I was really bummed that I didn't like this. And then I moved to the highly anticipated Changing All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, which I have talked about in more depth again in a Feature Friday. This is a dystopia that's looking at a kind of possible alternate reality future in which prisoners are entered into this kind of gladiator to the death game in order to win freedom from their convictions. And so we are following members of this game, we're following people that watch this game, we're following the rule changes and the kind of optics of everything. We're really interrogating humanity, the nature of the current justice system, the nature of the current penal system, and this thirst for violence and blood within our society. And even though this is set in a dystopian future, it also feels so very grounded in our present. Part of the way this is done is through the use of footnotes that kind of provide historical context for certain moments of the book. Sometimes this historical context is made up within the context of the book in terms particularly of certain technologies that are utilized within this world, but often it is very much rooted and grounded in our current reality. And so in many ways, this feels all too close and all too real, especially when we look at the way that we see viewers of this programming kind of locking in the way that they have optimized their homes so that they never miss a moment, and the voyeuristic nature of this, and this idea of when we as a society really justify this bloodshed and this violence, and how we separate ourselves and tell ourselves that we are good or just or right in some way, even when we are feeding in to this violent system. And at the same time, it really is exploring nature and justice and the realities of rehabilitation and forgiveness. And there are just so many complex, really nuanced conversations going on in this narrative that is so active and propulsive and engaging. And so it never feels like we are being talked to, even amidst those footnotes. Everything is melded just so beautifully. And like I said in the Feature Friday, I think you can really see the short story instincts at play here because these chapters kind of move around very episodically, and so we're put in and out of different pieces of this world given different views, and I think that that helps build this larger context. But I also think that that illustrates a really ingenious use of that short story background in order to elevate the story being told here. If you have not read his short story collection Friday Black, absolutely read it. This is absolutely one of my favorite books of the year. It definitely lived up for the hype for me, which is saying a lot because I don't necessarily gravitate toward dystopias first, but this is one of the books that makes the genre. So definitely keep this on your list if you haven't gotten to it yet. And speaking of very highly anticipated books, though I missed the anticipation part of this book and only really had it on my radar after it had already blown up, Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, which you have probably seen everywhere at this point, if you are anything like me, even cursorily on the bookish internet. And this is a fantasy romance involving dragons and a military dragon school where death is always a possibility. It features disabled rep and our protagonist who fights to prove she belongs amidst these people who are underestimating her. It of course features dragons, and it of course features sexual tension and romance. And so I dive into it all much more kind of in my video about it. I say kind of because I feel like I, again, just barely scraped the surface. There has been so much conversation around this book, and I feel like it has been very polarizing. I ultimately felt like I fell somewhere in the middle. This very much to me was the fan fiction you're still up reading at 2 a.m. And I don't say that as an insult. I say that because it feels like a style thing, a voice thing. It very much feels like we're kind of falling into these tropes and these archetypes. And because of that, not all of the development is super deep. We're working on assumptions on how these types of characters behave in many ways. We have the kind of brooding love interest that wants to kill us at the beginning of the book, or at least that's what they say. I never really bought that. But we're playing into these moments that we like to see that are satisfying. And if you're going in with that kind of mindset, you're gonna have fun. But if you're expecting a lot more of that really deep world building, it's gonna be a little harder, especially because some of the dialogue at the beginning of the book is a little clunky. The vernacular feels very modern, and so there are some moments that may throw you out a little bit because you don't have a full sense of this world to make sense of that modern vernacular within the world sometimes. But again, I think if you're just going in for a good time, you're gonna enjoy yourself. It was incredibly readable, it kept the action moving, and it was a lot of fun at the end of the day. And so again, I think my most controversial opinion here was that I was more middle of the road, but I did have a good time. And then finally, I read The Glow by Jessie Gaynor, which is about a PR professional in New York who needs to kind of raise her profile at her job. She's been slacking a little bit, and so she tells them that she is going to find them a wellness experience to add to their portfolio. And she ends up finding this retreat with this really enigmatic kind of wellness guru Instagram influencer type Cass, though the Instagram is run by her husband and she doesn't really have much say in it. This is a satire, though it doesn't always read fully satirical to me because it is pushing those extremes, but we also have a protagonist who isn't necessarily likable. It really kind of rebels or grounds us in her flaws and in her insecurities, which I think is really interesting and important. And I like the juxtaposition of looking at these deep inner insecurities amidst the Instagram age, and this idea of this perception of this kind of wellness culture and how we view it versus how we feel on the inside, except I don't know that we ever fully explore the kind of perception of it. Even though we're talking about the whole PR angle, it didn't really feel like it delved into the kind of internet aspect of it as much as I wanted, despite the cover very much feeling of that moment. And ultimately, the insecurities of our protagonist that we were really digging into felt sometimes, again, like they were presented more for that kind of shock and jar of it rather than to really fully deeply know this character. And so potentially purposefully, the narrative felt as kind of superficial as the world it was exploring. And again, while this may have been intentional to kind of examine the superficiality of this world, it didn't necessarily fully hit for me. I'll read what I wrote in my brief review here, which may summarize my thoughts a little better than I'm managing here, but it says, this one didn't really work for me. Extremely readable, but ultimately the characters, the plot, nor the conversation really went anywhere for me. Satirical, but not in a way that engaged with the questions as deeply as I hoped. Jane is obsessed with appearances and perception, but we don't dig past the shallow despite a blunt voice and acknowledging Jane's flaws in a way that wants us to think we do. So that, I think, really distills what I'm attempting to say about this one. I had a lot of hope. It fell a little flat for me, but like I said, the voice was really good. I really did like the writing in this. It just didn't really develop the ideas as much as I want. And again, that may have just been my own interpretation, so feel free to read and form your own thoughts and let me know what you think. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you think below. As always, thank you for hanging out and having any interest in what I have to say. Like, subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, as always, most importantly, and yeah, bye.